Have you ever had this experience where it's 2 p.m., you're at your desk or your kitchen table or a home office or wherever it is, and you're absolutely starving, which seems really strange because you had lunch just an hour ago, and it was a proper lunch of something substantial with protein, like a chicken salad or something sensible, and something that should keep you going for hours, but your stomach's growling, you can't concentrate, and all you can think about is whether there's any biscuits left in the tin. So you might go and have one, maybe two, and then you feel rubbish about it because you're really trying. You've been eating less for months, you've cut out all the obvious stuff, you're doing all the things that you're supposed to do, and yet nothing's happening. The scales haven't budged. You might have even put on a bit of weight. And there's this thought that you might never say out loud to anyone, which is maybe I've just ruined my metabolism. Maybe I've broken something that can't be fixed. And this is something I hear constantly from the women I work with, this specific pattern of eating less than they ever have and being really disciplined about it and still constantly hungry, unable to lose weight and often actually gaining weight. And here's what's crazy about it. It's not a food problem. Well, it's not just a food problem. What's actually happening is that one of your body's most important hormonal signals has completely gone offline. And that hormone is called leptin. And when leptin signaling stops working properly, your body essentially loses its fuel gauge. It genuinely can't tell how much energy you've got stored. So it thinks you're starving even when you're not. And the really frustrating part of this is that you can eat less and less, try harder and harder, and your body just keeps screaming that it needs more food. So today we're going to talk about why this happens, why women who used to be able to skip meals without thinking about it, women who could lose half a stone in a week if they needed to, suddenly find themselves unable to shift weight despite doing everything right. And we are going to talk about what's actually going on at a cellular level, because once you understand the mechanism, once you see why your body's responding this way, it stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling more like a signal problem, a timing problem, something that can actually be sorted. So before we dive in, if you want my free guide, 3 hidden signals your body is missing, you can grab it at francisnorgate.com/resources. It walks you through the 3 most common circadian signals that get disrupted and how to start correcting them. It's all practical with no wellness fluff, I promise. And if you're not already subscribed to my weekly newsletter, Quantum Nourishment Weekly, I send out a newsletter with actionable circadian health strategies every week, things you can actually implement. It's cutting-edge science made accessible. So you can subscribe to that at francisnorgate.com/resources or find me on Substack at francisnorgate.substack.com. All right, so let's talk about leptin. So if you don't know me already, my name is Frances Norgate, a certified nutrition and lifestyle advisor qualified at the Institute for Optimum Nutrition, a member of the Federation of Holistic Therapists, and an ambassador for the Public Health Collaboration charity in the UK. And just a quick disclaimer as well, this is not medical advice, so if you've got specific health concerns, please do work with your healthcare provider. This is about understanding your body better, but it's not a replacement for proper medical care. And before we dive in, just a quick note on what quantum nourishment actually means in case you're new here. It's really just combining 3 things, so nutritional science, circadian biology, and nervous system regulation. And I realise some of you listening might be thinking, well, I've already tried functional nutrition. I've been to functional medicine practitioners, I've done the Dutch tests and the GI maps and spent thousands of pounds on supplements. And I hear you, many of the women I work with have done exactly that. And here's what I've found working with women that say that. Functional medicine is brilliant at identifying what's dysregulated. It will tell you your cortisol pattern is off, your gut is a mess, your hormones are all over the place, or you've got inflammation markers and all of that. But it often doesn't address why those things are dysregulated in the first place. So it's like if your house alarm keeps going off, functional medicine will tell you which sensors are triggered, but it won't necessarily tell you why someone keeps trying to break in. What I'm talking about with quantum nourishment is the foundational environmental signals your body needs to function properly. So light, meal timing, sleep-wake cycles, nervous system safety. When those signals are chaotic or missing, everything downstream becomes dysregulated. Your cortisol gets wonky, your gut struggles, your hormones get thrown off, you develop inflammation. You can take all the supplements in the world to try to correct those downstream problems, and sometimes they do help for a while, but if the fundamental signals are still off, the problems will keep coming back because your body doesn't compartmentalize. Your nervous system affects your hormones affect your metabolism, your circadian rhythm affects absolutely everything. So quantum nourishment is just looking at the whole picture, not treating symptoms in isolation, but understanding how all these symptoms talk to each other and starting with the foundational signals that govern everything else. So I really hope that makes sense. All right, so let's dive into today's episode. So here's the scenario I see over and over again. A woman in, let's say, her mid-40s, maybe she's a director at a tech company, maybe she runs a consultancy, maybe she's managing a household of 4 kids while running a side business. It doesn't really matter. What matters is this: she's capable. She's been capable her entire adult life. 5 to 10 years ago, if she needed to lose weight, maybe for a wedding, maybe just because she felt sluggish, she could do it. She'd tighten up her diet for 2 weeks, maybe add in some extra walks, and the weight would just come off. Not necessarily effortless, but doable. But now she's been being good for 3 months. She's eating less than she did 5 years ago. She's cut out sugar. She's meal prepping. She's going to the gym. She's doing everything the internet tells her to do. And the scales just haven't moved, or it's gone up. So she cuts calories even further. Maybe she's at 1,200 calories a day now, but still nothing. So she adds in more exercise, but still nothing. And here's what's maybe happening in her head, and I can guess this because I've heard this many times, is that what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this anymore? And have I permanently broken my metabolism? Is this just what getting older feels like, and do I just have to accept that this is the way my body is now? And that sort of quiet self-blame, that feeling of incompetence almost, which is so strange because this is someone who's competent at everything else in her life. She can manage teams, run businesses, solve complex problems, juggling multiple responsibilities without breaking a sweat, but she can't lose 10 pounds. And here's the really frustrating part, is that she's hungrier than she ever was. She's thinking about food constantly. She's having these intense cravings. She's waking up at 3 a.m. thinking about biscuits. She feels out of control around food in a way she never has before. So she assumes it's a willpower problem, a discipline problem, a character flaw, but it's not. What's actually happening is that her body's ability to sense how much energy it has stored, its fuel gauge essentially, has stopped working properly. And when your fuel gauge isn't working, your body genuinely believes it's running on empty, even when the tank is full. And that's called leptin resistance. Okay, so let's talk about what leptin actually is, because if you've never heard of it, this is going to be new territory. And if you have heard of it, you might have heard of it described as the satiety hormone, or the hormone that tells you when you're full, which is true, but it's also a little bit more complex than that. So leptin is a hormone that's produced by your fat cells. Specifically, it's produced by adipose tissue, which is your body's fat stores, in proportion to how much fat you have. So the more fat tissues you have, the more leptin you produce. And leptin's job is to travel through your bloodstream up to your brain, specifically to a region called the hypothalamus, which is kind of like your metabolic control center, and to deliver a message. The message is basically, we have enough energy stored, we are good, we can stop eating now, and you can ramp up energy expenditure. So leptin is essentially your body's way of communicating to your brain about your energy status. So when leptin's working properly, here's what happens. You eat a meal, your fat cells release leptin, leptin travels to your brain, and then your brain receives the signal, okay, we are fed, we have fuel, we can stop thinking about food now. So you feel satisfied, your energy's stable, and you're not thinking about the next meal the second you stop eating. But when leptin signaling stops working properly, when you develop what's called leptin resistance, here's what happens. Your fat cells are still producing leptin. In fact, if you're carrying extra weight, they're probably producing a lot of leptin, but your brain can't hear the signal anymore. So it's like the communication line has gone a bit fuzzy, or like the leptin is knocking on the door, but nobody's home to answer. So your brain starts to believe you're genuinely in an energy crisis. It thinks you're starving, even though you have plenty of stored energy, even though you ate 2 hours ago. And when your brain thinks you're starving, it does exactly what it's designed to do, which is to make you feel hungrier. It slows down your metabolism to conserve energy. It makes you think about food constantly. It drives you towards calorie-dense foods like biscuits, chocolate, or bread, because from your brain's perspective, you need calories fast. So this is not a willpower problem, this is a hormonal communication problem. It's not that your capability has declined, it's that your leptin signaling has gone offline. So how does this happen? How do you go from having a perfectly functional leptin system to having one that's completely unresponsive? So this is where it gets interesting, and honestly, this is where the research really opened my eyes, because I realized how many things I was doing, things that seemed healthy, things that I'd been told were good for me, that were actually making this worse. And there are a few key mechanisms here. I'm going to explain them as simply as I can, but I'm also going to use some technical terms because I think it's important to understand what's actually happening at a cellular level. So mechanism 1 is chronic hyperleptinemia. This is a fancy way of saying too much leptin for too long. So remember, leptin levels correlate with how much fat you have stored. So if you're carrying extra weight, your fat cells are pumping out leptin constantly, trying to signal to your brain, we have enough energy, stop eating. But here's the problem. When your brain is exposed to really high levels of leptin all the time, it starts to tune out the signal. It's a bit like, when someone keeps shouting at you constantly and eventually you just stop listening. So the leptin receptors in your brain, those little docking stations where leptin's supposed to bind and deliver its message, they start to become less responsive and they become desensitized. So then you end up in this paradox of high leptin but low leptin sensitivity. Your body's screaming that it has enough energy, but your brain can't hear it. Mechanism 2 is impaired transport across the blood-brain barrier. So this one's quite interesting. Leptin has to travel from your bloodstream into your brain to do its job. And there's a transport system for this, a kind of ferry system that carries leptin across what's called the blood-brain barrier. But in leptin resistance, this transport system can become saturated or dysfunctional. So if you have high levels of leptin in your bloodstream, less of it is actually getting into your brain where it needs to work. It's a bit like having a package delivery system that's overwhelmed, so the packages are piling up, but they're not getting to where they need to go. Mechanism 3 is intracellular signaling disruption. Okay, so this is where it gets a bit technical, but stay with me because this one's really important. So when leptin binds to its receptor in your brain, it's supposed to activate a signaling pathway. So essentially, it sets off a chain reaction that tells your brain, we are fed, we can stop eating, but there are these molecules that act as brakes on this signaling pathway, and they're negative feedback regulators. So in a healthy system, these brakes are there to prevent the signaling from being too strong for too long, and that's completely normal. But in leptin resistance, these braking molecules are overactive. They're essentially slamming on the brakes constantly, preventing the leptin signal from getting through, even when leptin is present. So it's not just that leptin can't get into the brain or that receptors are desensitized, it's also that even when leptin does bind to its receptor, the signal gets shut down before it can actually do its job. Mechanism 4 is hypothalamic inflammation. So this is a big one, and this is also where circadian rhythm comes in, which we'll get into in a minute. But your hypothalamus, that metabolic control center in your brain, can become inflamed. Not inflamed in the way you might think of a sprained ankle being inflamed, but it's like a low-grade chronic inflammation at a cellular level. And when your hypothalamus is inflamed, it can't process leptin signals properly. The inflammation interferes with the whole system. So what causes this inflammation? Well, it's several things, including dietary imbalances, environmental toxins, chronic stress, persistent nervous system dysregulation, and this is the key part, circadian misalignment. So I need to tell you something that I don't talk about much, but I think it's really relevant here, so I'll talk about it. A few years ago, I was stuck in a really frustrating pattern. I'd been eating well for months. I was doing all the right things, plenty of vegetables, good quality protein, very little sugar, minimal processed foods. I was really proud of how I was eating, to be honest, but I was exhausted all the time and I had skin rashes and I was hungry a lot. And this sort of constant hunger, even though I thought I was eating well and eating enough. So things like I would eat breakfast, but then I'd be hungry within an hour, and I'd eat lunch and be ravenous by 3 p.m. And I just couldn't understand it because I was eating enough calories, I wasn't restricting, I wasn't doing anything extreme at all. I was just eating well, or so I thought. But I was also, and I didn't realize this at the time, I was completely ignoring my circadian rhythm. I was getting up with my kids, but I wasn't getting outside. I'd make breakfast in artificial light, get everyone sorted, and by the time I stepped outside, it was 10 or 11, probably at the earliest most of the time, and sometimes even later. I was also eating at really random times. Sometimes I'd have breakfast at 7 a.m., sometimes at 9 a.m., lunch might be noon or 2 p.m., or I'd skip it completely if I was really busy, and then sometimes I'd be on my laptop till 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. with that blue light coming into my eyes and on my face, sometimes right up until bedtime, and I was getting to bed quite late as well. And I was really chronically stressed because I had small children and I was up several times a night. We have them at home 24/7 because we do homeschooling. So my nervous system was in a constant state of low-level activation. And from a food perspective, I was doing pretty much everything right. But from a circadian perspective, from a nervous system perspective, I was sending my body completely chaotic signals. And here's what I didn't understand at the time was that my leptin signaling was completely offline. My body genuinely thought I was in an energy crisis, even though I wasn't. My fat cells were producing leptin, but between the circadian misalignment, the chronic stress, the lack of proper light exposure, the inconsistent meal timing, my brain couldn't process the signal. So I was hungry all the time, despite eating well, despite having plenty of stored energy. And it wasn't until I started learning about circadian biology, really diving into the research on light exposure, meal timing, cortisol rhythm, that I realized this isn't a food problem. This is a timing problem and a rhythm problem. And honestly, that was such a relief because I'd been blaming myself, thinking I must be doing something wrong with my food, thinking I probably just needed more discipline and eat even better than I was, but it wasn't discipline, it was the signals. So here's where everything connects, because leptin doesn't operate in isolation, it's part of your circadian system. So leptin levels naturally follow a daily rhythm, they're lowest in the early morning and they peak at night during sleep. And then this rhythm is orchestrated by your body's master clock, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which I talk about in every episode. Let's just call it your master clock anyway. It's a tiny cluster of cells in your brain that acts like a conductor, synchronizing all of your body's rhythms. And your master clock is set primarily by one thing, which is light, specifically morning light. When morning sunlight hits specialized cells in your eyes, cells called melanopsin cells, which detect light, they send signals directly to your master clock. And this signal says it's morning, it's time to wake up, time to ramp up cortisol, time to prepare for the day's metabolic demands. And this morning signal, this timestamp, is what synchronizes your entire hormonal system, including leptin. But here's what happens when you don't get that morning light signal. Your master clock drifts, your hormonal rhythms become desynchronized, your cortisol rhythm becomes flattened or delayed, your leptin rhythm gets disrupted, and when leptin's natural rhythm is disrupted, when it's not peaking at the right time, not declining at the right time, your brain stops being able to interpret the signal properly. It's like if you imagine trying to read a clock that's telling you it's 3 p.m. when it's actually 9 p.m. The information is there, but the timing's so off that it's meaningless. And that's what happens with leptin when your circadian rhythm is misaligned. But it gets worse because it's not just about light. There is a meal timing connection. Leptin's rhythm is also profoundly shaped by when you eat. So there's research showing that when feeding occurs at times that are misaligned with your body's natural circadian rhythm, they call this wrongly timed feeding, it can cause significant metabolic dysfunction. For instance, eating late at night after biological night has begun, after your body has started ramping up melatonin and winding down metabolic processes. When you eat during this time, you're pushing calories into a system that's in rest and repair mode, not fuel handling mode. Your insulin sensitivity drops sharply at night. Your body's ability to process glucose is impaired, and this mistimed eating disrupts leptin signaling. And there's research showing that when you fast during the day and eat during the biological night, which is what happens when you skip breakfast and have your largest meal in the evening, leptin levels drop more dramatically during the subsequent fasting period. And this drop triggers a stronger perception of energy deficit in the brain. So your body interprets this as scarcity, as unpredictable food availability, and it responds by ramping up hunger, slowing metabolism, and holding on to stored energy. So from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If food is only available at unpredictable times or during times when you're normally supposed to be resting, your body interprets this as a survival situation. It thinks we need to store every calorie we get because we don't know when the next meal is coming. But in our modern context, where food is constantly available, this adaptive response becomes maladaptive. It leads to increased fat storage, chronic hunger, and metabolic dysfunction. So now there's also the cortisol connection, which is another piece to this puzzle. So cortisol is often called the stress hormone, but it's also a metabolic hormone. It plays a crucial role in regulating energy balance. So under normal conditions, cortisol follows a predictable rhythm. It peaks in the morning right around the time you wake up and gradually declines throughout the day to its lowest levels at night. And this natural cortisol rhythm is crucial for supporting proper leptin function. There's research showing that normal cortisol secretion is necessary to potentiate, essentially to amplify the effects of insulin on leptin's nighttime peak. So when your cortisol rhythm is healthy, it supports leptin's rhythm. They work together, but when cortisol becomes dysregulated, when it's elevated at the wrong times or when the rhythm becomes flattened, it interferes with leptin signaling. And what causes cortisol dysregulation? Well, there's several things, including chronic stress, which you might have heard of, but also circadian misalignment, lack of morning light exposure, inconsistent sleep schedules, eating at irregular times. So basically all of the things that we do in modern life. So when cortisol is chronically elevated or dysregulated, it promotes increased fat production, particularly around your middle, and it also contributes to leptin resistance by creating a state of chronic low-grade inflammation in your hypothalamus. And here's where it becomes a vicious cycle. So leptin resistance itself can lead to an increased stress response and further cortisol production. So if you get stuck in this feedback loop where cortisol dysregulation causes leptin resistance and leptin resistance causes more cortisol dysregulation, then that becomes a bit problematic. Now, if you happen to be a woman in your 40s, there's another layer of this that we need to talk about because perimenopause throws a massive spanner into an already complex system. So leptin is particularly relevant for women, and it plays a significant role in reproductive health and fertility. And during perimenopause, when estrogen and progesterone are fluctuating wildly, leptin signaling becomes even more vulnerable to disruption. And women in perimenopause often experience sleep disturbances, hot flushes, increased stress, mood changes, and all of those exacerbate circadian misalignment. So you might already be struggling with sleep because of night sweats, so you're not getting that deep restorative sleep that supports healthy cortisol and leptin rhythms. You might be experiencing increased anxiety or irritability, which keeps your nervous system in a chronic state of activation. Your hormonal balance, which was already delicate, is now completely disrupted by fluctuating estrogen and progesterone, and all of this makes you more susceptible to leptin resistance. And this is why women in their 40s often describe the experience, I used to be able to lose weight quite easily, but now nothing works. I'm doing the same things I always did, but my body's not responding. It's not that you're doing something wrong, it's just that the hormonal landscape has shifted and the rules have changed as a result, and your body needs different signals now than it did 10 years ago. The mistake is assuming the problem is just food, assuming you just need to eat less, try harder, be more disciplined. But when leptin resistance is driven by circadian misalignment and hormonal disruption, eating less doesn't fix it. In fact, it can sometimes make it worse. So this is the part that I think is genuinely mind-blowing when you first hear it, because it goes against everything we've been taught about weight loss. So here's what happens when you go on a calorie-restricted diet. Your leptin levels drop rapidly, and this makes sense, right? You're eating less, you might be losing some fat, and your fat cells produce less leptin. But here's the problem. When leptin drops below a certain threshold, your body's individualized set point, your brain interprets this as starvation. And when your brain perceives starvation, it activates ancient survival mechanisms. It increases hunger significantly. So you're not imagining it. Your appetite genuinely does go up. It decreases your energy expenditure, your metabolism slows down, your body becomes more efficient at using calories, because from your body's perspective, calories are scarce and need to be conserved, and it triggers coordinated neuroendocrine changes that favor survival and energy accumulation. So your thyroid function might decrease, your reproductive hormones might become suppressed, your stress hormones may increase, and all of this is your body trying to protect you from what it perceives as a life-threatening energy deficit. And here's the really cruel part. When you inevitably regain the weight, because it's almost impossible to maintain a calorie deficit long term when your body is actively fighting you, your leptin levels go back up. But now you might have even more leptin resistance than you had before, because the repeated cycle of restriction and regain has created more metabolic dysfunction. So this is why yo-yo dieting is so damaging. It's not a moral failing, it's a physiological response to perceived scarcity. Your brain essentially buckles down to make up the lost fat. It increases hunger, it decreases expenditure, and it's doing everything in its power to restore what it perceives as your set point for fat mass. And this is why focusing purely on eating less without addressing the underlying circadian and hormonal dysfunction often backfires. You can't out-restrict a leptin problem. So what do you do? If leptin resistance is driven by circadian misalignment, hormonal disruption, and chronic metabolic stress, how do you actually fix it? Here's what the research shows, and here's what I've seen work both for myself and patterns I observe with women who've addressed this. So priority number 1 is morning light exposure. This is a non-negotiable. So you need to get outside within 30 to 60 minutes of waking up and expose your eyes to natural daylight, not through a window, not with sunglasses on unless you have a medical condition that requires you to wear sunglasses, but actual outdoor light. Now, why is this? It's because morning light is the primary signal that sets your master clock. It's what initiates the metabolic ramp up for the day. It's what starts the cortisol awakening response, which then supports proper leptin rhythm. There's direct research showing that morning light exposure can modulate leptin concentrations. Studies on people who were sleep deprived showed that morning exposure to light significantly increased leptin levels compared to dim light conditions. And I know what you might be thinking if you live in northern climates, but it's grey here. It's always grey. There's no sunlight in the morning. And I totally hear you because I live in Ireland. I've stood outside in all sorts of conditions, cloudy conditions, rainy conditions, when it was snowing, and sometimes felt ridiculous, wondering if it's actually doing anything for me. But here's the thing, even on a completely overcast day, outdoor light is 10 to 100 times brighter than indoor light. So your eyes can detect that difference, even if it doesn't feel like bright light to you. So yes, even in the rain, even when it's grey, even when it's snowing, you need to get outside first thing in the morning. Priority 2 is meal timing. So the second intervention is aligning your eating with your circadian rhythm. So this means eat during daylight hours where possible, front load your calories earlier in the day. So eat most of your big meals earlier in the day and stop eating well before bedtime. Specifically, this might look like a substantial breakfast within an hour or two of waking up, decent lunch, and eating a lighter dinner, ideally finished at least 3 to 4 hours before bed, and not eating late at night, not snacking every 2 hours throughout the day, and not having your largest meal at 8 p.m. Why? Because your insulin sensitivity is highest in the morning and decreases as the day goes on. Your body is primed to process fuel earlier in the day and not later. So when you eat at night after melatonin has started rising, after your body has begun its rest and repair mode, you're working against your natural metabolic rhythm. And there's research showing that mistimed feeding directly disrupts leptin signaling. Eating during the biological night can cause leptin levels to drop more dramatically during subsequent fasting, which triggers stronger hunger signals. So you want to eat when your body is metabolically primed to handle food, not when it's trying to rest. Priority number 3 is nervous system regulation. So this one's less talked about, but it's absolutely critical. If your nervous system is chronically activated, if you're in a constant state of low-level stress, it sends persistent threat signals to your cells. And when your cells perceive threat, they shift from efficient energy production to cellular defense mode. And they're not going to be responsive to leptin satiety signal when they think you're in danger. So this is why practices that promote nervous system safety, things like somatic work, vagus nerve stimulation, breath work, time in nature, these aren't just nice to haves. So they're actually metabolic interventions. When you help your nervous system shift from a state of chronic activation to a state of safety and rest, you're literally changing the signals your cells are receiving. And that can indirectly support improved leptin sensitivity. Priority 4 is to reduce inflammatory triggers. So hypothalamic inflammation is a significant underlying cause of leptin resistance. So anything you can do to reduce inflammation is going to help. And this includes reducing exposure to environmental toxins as much as possible, addressing gut infections if you have them, managing chronic stress, and eating a diet that supports rather than inflames. And for most people, this means reducing refined carbohydrates and sugars, prioritizing protein and healthy fats, eating plenty of vegetables, and avoiding foods that cause personal reactions. Not because carbs are inherently bad, but because chronically elevated insulin, which comes from frequent high-carb meals, competes with leptin for receptor sites in your brain. Insulin can literally block leptin from doing its job. So if you're constantly spiking insulin, you're impairing leptin signaling. Priority number 5 is to prioritize sleep. Sleep quality and timing profoundly influences leptin. Poor sleep disrupts the natural rhythm of leptin rising at night, and studies show that restricted sleep can lead to leptin levels being significantly lower, with the nocturnal peak occurring earlier and being much less pronounced. And at the same time, ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, goes up when you don't sleep enough. So then you get this double hit of less satiety signal and more hunger signal. If you're not sleeping well, addressing leptin resistance becomes much, much more difficult. So what does this actually look like when you start implementing these interventions? So let me walk you through a typical progression based on patterns I've observed. In week 1, you might not feel much different. In fact, you might feel more tired initially because you're changing established patterns. You're getting outside in the morning, even though it feels a bit pointless. You're eating breakfast when maybe you used to skip it. You're stopping eating earlier in the evening, which might make you feel hungry at first. And your body is recalibrating, but you probably won't notice obvious changes just yet. At a cellular level, though, your master clock is starting to receive clearer signals. Your cortisol rhythm is beginning to realign, and the wheels are starting to turn. In weeks 2 to 3, this is when you might notice some small things, subtle shifts. Maybe you don't need that third coffee quite as desperately. Maybe you wake up feeling slightly more refreshed. Maybe you notice one afternoon where you didn't have that 3 p.m. crash. And these are subtle changes. You might doubt whether anything's actually happening, but these are signs that your leptin signaling is beginning to recalibrate. In weeks 4 to 6, this is when it really starts to feel real, and this is when it really clicks. Your energy becomes more stable throughout the day. You're not thinking about food constantly. You go between meals without feeling ravenous. Your hunger cues start to feel normal again, like they make sense. You eat a meal, you feel satisfied, and you're not immediately thinking about the next meal. And this is leptin beginning to work properly again. Your fuel gauge is starting to give accurate readings, and women often describe this moment as, wait, I actually feel okay, I feel like myself, and that is the moment that you're looking for. And then month 3 and beyond, by this point, you've established a new baseline. Your body has adapted to the new signals. Your energy feels different, not perfect. Some days, you are still harder than others, but overall, you feel capable again. You can trust your hunger cues. You're not battling constant cravings. Food doesn't feel like this constant mental battle. And quite often, not always, but this is when your body composition starts to shift naturally without extreme restriction, because your body finally has accurate information about your energy status. It's not perfect, it's not linear, but you start to feel like yourself again. And here's what I really want you to understand is that this whole thing, it's not about discipline. It's not that you're not disciplined enough. It's not that you've lost your edge and you have not permanently broken your metabolism. What's happening here is that your body's communication system has become dysregulated. The signals are off, the timing is off, the rhythm is off. And when signals are off, everything downstream becomes compromised. But signals are something that can be corrected. And this is what I do with the women I work with. We don't start with food, we start with the foundational signals, which are light, meal timing, sleep, nervous system regulation, in that specific order. Because you can eat perfectly, but if your circadian rhythm is misaligned and your leptin signaling is offline, you're fighting an uphill battle. So you could spend the next 6 to 12 months trying to piece this together yourself from podcasts and articles, trying different things, seeing what works, or you could have the exact protocol in order with troubleshooting for when things don't go as expected. I'm definitely not saying that you can't figure this out on your own. You absolutely can, but having a clear starting point and clear progression buys back time, and it buys back months or even years of frustration. And that's what the Quantum Nourishment Blueprint is about. It's the same framework I use with my bespoke one-to-one intensive clients, but delivered as a self-paced course. So you get the protocol, you get the troubleshooting, and you even get support from me for the first 6 months. And you get to do all of this at your own pace, but we'll talk more about that in future episodes. For now, I just want you to understand that this is something that is totally fixable. So here's what I want you to take away from this week's episode. If you've been eating less, trying harder, doing everything right, and still feeling constantly hungry, still unable to lose weight, your metabolism is not broken. What's likely happening is that your leptin signaling has gone offline due to circadian misalignment. Your brain genuinely can't tell how much energy you have stored, so it thinks you're starving even when you're not. And you can't fix this by eating less. You have to fix the underlying signals, which are light, meal timings, sleep, nervous system safety. And when those signals come back online, leptin can start working again. Your fuel gauge can start giving accurate readings and your body can stop fighting you. It won't happen overnight, but steadily, progressively, over weeks and months, you can feel like yourself again and you can get your capability back. And before we finish, I just want to mention again that if you want my free guide, The 3 Hidden Signals Your Body is Missing, you can grab that at francesnorgate.com/resources. It goes into more practical detail on how to implement these circadian signals. And if you want more content like this, I send out a weekly newsletter called Quantum Nourishment Weekly. Every week I share actionable strategies for energy and metabolic health, and I try to make real science practical for everybody. So you can subscribe to that at francesnorgate.com/resources or on Substack at francesnorgate.substack.com. And if you happen to enjoy this episode, I would be so grateful if you could subscribe and leave a review. It genuinely helps other women to find this show. Okay, so next week we're going to talk about sleep. But here's what I haven't told you yet. There's one specific thing that almost every woman does in the evening. It seems completely innocent, but it's the single biggest thing that tells your body to stay in energy storage mode overnight instead of repair mode. When I learned this during my training, when I really understood the mechanism of how evening light exposure affects melatonin, which then affects insulin, which then affects overnight fat metabolism, I remember thinking this totally explains why women can eat perfectly all day and still wake up feeling puffy and exhausted. The connection between evening light exposure, melatonin suppression, and metabolic function at night is profound. Once you understand it, you can't unsee it. So I'm going to break down the entire light melatonin metabolism connection next week, because if you're doing everything right during the day, but your evenings are awash of bright screens and artificial light, this might be the missing piece. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Take care and see you next week.